we are unfortunately going to continue to see, in part because with this rapid expansion of sanctions, OFAC is getting into markets like aluminum markets, electronics markets, things like that, where they don't really have a lot of subject matter expertise, historically have not had a lot of subject matter expertise. And so they're really grappling with kind of issues they haven't thought about before, how supply chains work, what kind of due diligence issues are reasonable for a non-bank that doesn't really understand. You know, if you're a retailer, you don't know who all your customers are the way a bank does. And I think OFAC's really trying to grapple with a wide variety of kind of novel definitional and compliance issues that they just haven't thought about before. But that they are going to have to think about going forward. With that, let me turn it over to Suzanne.
Thanks so much. Thanks to Ken and to Bill for bringing us all here together, and thanks to my co-panelists for saying a lot of what really needs to be said. So I will try to keep my remarks fairly short. And inevitably, they're going to be focused on Iran because that's where I do most of my work. Iran is, of course, the poster child for U.S. sanctions, having been under some form of American economic restrictions since November, the aftermath of November 4th, 1979, when Iranian students overtook the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and began a siege that lasted for 444 days and led to the actual rupture of relations between what the new Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States, two countries that had been closely aligned in the past, and two countries where there were intense and intricate business and commercial ties for many years that had to be unwound in the period after. Iran for many years was kind of cited as the one country that demonstrated the limitations of unilateral American sanctions, because in fact for most of this 40-year period we were the only country in the world that was willing to apply economic pressure to Iran. There were a variety of reasons for that, but I think primarily because of Iran's significance in energy markets. There was a fundamental disinterest on the part of many of our closest allies, even at times of real concern about Iran's activities. So during the hostage crisis, many of our European allies actually expanded trade with Iran. The Japanese helped the Iranians find ways to manage the asset freeze that the U.S. had applied to Iranian assets as part of that first round of sanctions. And there have been other periods in which American reliance on economic pressure with Iran has actually led to fundamental pressures and ruptures with some of our closest allies, most notably during the Clinton administration when, for the first time, the United States tried to apply extraterritorial sanctions to Iran and fundamentally largely failed. With what was then the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, a measure that was intended to penalize third countries that were investing more than $20 million in Iran's energy sector. It was never really applied. The first waiver was granted in 1998 for that measure, and for the ensuing 20 years, there were really no actions under the evolving Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. And so that brings me to today, because we're back again in this period of a real disjuncture between American policy toward Iran and American sanctions on Iran and the rest of the world. And as the sort of debate about the deal heated up, there was a lot of sort of casual assumption on the part of many analysts that if we reverted to a go-it-alone approach in terms of sanctioning Iran, that we would find ourselves ineffective in that. And I think one of the lessons from at least the early phase of this new application of American economic pressure has been a real demonstration of the weight of the U.S. marketplace, because what we have seen already is that companies have run for the hills. From the moment at which the president announced his decision to leave the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the formal name for the Iran nuclear deal, there was a sort of rapid effort to try to wind down business with Iran. And that flew in the face in many cases of comments made by some of the partners to the deal and some of our closest allies in Europe who are seeking to find ways to preserve the deal, to preserve the economic incentives that were fundamental to getting the Iranians to make concessions on their nuclear program. They were all, in fact, the European governments were saying, we are going to find a way to ensure that business continues as usual. We will reinstitute, and they have, a blocking mechanism which ostensibly precludes any implementation of American sanctions on European businesses. But businesses were voting with their feet. Firms were looking for ways to wind down their activities in Iran as quickly as possible. And I think that that is both a notable development, but also potentially a dangerous one, because I think it will only reinforce the infatuation with sanctions as a tool of diplomacy. The sense that, in fact, we've done it, and there has been, at least if you look globally, no real collateral damage to the relationships and to the effectiveness of this tool. And also, I think a tactical success that we've seen in the implementation of sanctions since the president's announcement in May on the Iran nuclear deal is this maximalist approach, which differs in some ways from the Obama administration, in part, well, for all sorts of reasons. But you had a different balance between Congress and the executive branch at that time. You had a different end goal from the administration itself in terms of the use of sanctions. And so the Obama administration sought to use these very powerful tools in calibrated fashion. For example, with the measures that impacted transactions involving the Iranian central bank and that therefore had the potential to disrupt oil exports and payments for them, the Obama administration sought to establish a sort of band of compliance with those that would be about 16 to 20% reductions over a 6-month period, whereas the Trump administration has said we want everybody to go to zero immediately. There was a lot of skepticism that they would in fact succeed in that. And in part, I think what we've seen is that was a deliberate tactic on the part of the administration, because they recognized that they had really very limited capacity to force certain countries to go to zero, those countries being most notably China and to a lesser extent India, major importers of Iranian crude. But they could, in fact, potentially scare or intimidate or pressure a number of other both governments and companies that were importers of Iranian crude. And so we've seen South Korea, we've seen Japan moving towards zero, we've seen companies from Western Europe, despite the fact that their governments would prefer to continue some mechanisms for trade with Iran, in fact, complying. And so maximalism, even where it's not uniformly implemented, has actually succeeded thus far for the Trump administration. And the third area where I think you can describe this new use of sanctions by the Trump administration on Iran as a success is simply that there hasn't been the kind of blowback that many anticipated in the run-up in the debate about what Trump might or might not do about the nuclear deal. Many said that, if you do this, if you start putting pressure, sure, it didn't lead to higher oil prices the last time, but there were a variety of factors to do with energy markets that prompted that. Thus far, and we'll wait to see, because the deadline for the 180-day wind down is on November 4th, midterm elections are on November 6th, but to date, while there has been upward pressure around prices, the overall OPEC, non-OPEC arrangement that has led to higher levels of production has in fact at least kept the price increase from translating in really dramatic fashion to the price that Americans pay at the pump. And it doesn't appear to be a major issue in at least the near-term domestic political calculus for the administration, nor do the frictions and dissatisfaction and sense of betrayal that remains, I think, quite high among our allies in Europe and other partners to the deal, Russia and China, nor has that really created a kind of blowback. So you can look at this and say, wow, this has really worked. It's fantastic. Let's keep using these sanctions. But here's the problem. At least from a strategic point of view, the sanctions on Iran and the application of them by the Trump administration have to be counted as a strategic failure to date. And part of that really comes down to the fact that, as you all know, sanctions are a tool of policy. They are not, in fact, a policy. And there's no real sense anywhere in the world, or frankly, not even in Washington, of exactly what it is the Trump administration is trying to get from these sanctions. Do they want the Iranians to capitulate on all 12 demands that Secretary Pompeo laid out in a speech at the Heritage Foundation shortly after the president made his announcement on the nuclear deal, which entailed everything, essentially. Iran getting out of the business of all the bad things that it does all around the Middle East and treating its population much better and giving up everything. A colleague in the Bush administration said to me, they can't even have nuclear dentistry. This was the kind of maximalism that Secretary Pompeo articulated. President Trump keeps talking about how he expects to see the Iranians come back to the negotiating table, almost with a sense of urgency, and there's been a lot of I think, speculation about what could happen next week, the UN General Assembly, which is the only time in the typical calendar when a senior Iranian official, that being the president, comes to the United States. There were efforts last year by the Trump administration to in fact broker a meeting between the Iranian president and President Trump. The Iranians declined. They saw it as a trap. And this is what I think is the difficulty of these current sanctions. If in fact the administration wants a negotiation with Iran, be it big, be it small, be it comprehensive, the Iranians have no willingness to engage in that negotiation under the current circumstances, because the sanctions are seen, and the use of the sanctions and the walking away from the deal are seen as such a violation of a carefully negotiated agreement. Why would you come back to the table with those people who just pulled the rug out from a deal that took more than a decade to negotiate? And because at the same time there are others within the administration and the sort of really severe application of these sanctions has meant that there is a presumption that in fact this administration doesn't want a negotiation at all. What they want is either pressure for the sake of pressure, or in the case of the National Security Advisor and possibly the Secretary of State and others, what they really want is regime change. And so if that's their game, there's no point in sitting down at the table with them. The difficulty for the Iranians is they don't really have a good way out of this box that they're in. And so, I think it's going to be a very interesting period for diplomacy on Iran. Their economy, the sanctions have already had a very severe effect on the economy. They've contributed to, I think, a sense of long-standing alienation among some segments of the population. There's a real concern within the leadership about the domestic viability of the continuation of the regime. But in effect, their options are pretty poor. As I said, negotiations are not likely to lead to a short-term turnaround in their economic situation. There's a lot of concerns about retaliation, and when we talk about collateral damage, the possibilities of some kind of a bilateral military engagement, something that I think the administration doesn't want, and that the Iranians ultimately may use as a means of trying to demonstrate their dissatisfaction with the status quo, can lock us into all kinds of collateral damage across the board for American interests and industries around the world. But fundamentally, the Iranians have no prospect of riding out the storm. And there are some long-term collateral damage that comes with all of this, which is that as our partners and allies look at what has happened in the wake of diplomacy with Iran and with the change in the administration having such a dramatic effect on something that they all invested in for their own security interests, I think it is going to drive more interest and effort over time in alternatives to the U.S. financial system. They're not short-term fixes. The Europeans have sought to try to create mechanisms to facilitate trade between Iran and the rest of the world, and they will have very limited success in doing so. But if Russia, China, and the Europeans make an effort over a period of years, I think it is quite possible that we could see a reduction in the relevance and significance of the U.S. dollar in financial markets, and obviously that isn't a net positive for the United States. Thanks.
Thank you. You raised a whole bunch of interesting issues, and we don't have a lot of time, so I'll ask a couple questions, then we'll go to the audience, if that's all right. And let's first ask the other two panelists if they can pick up on Suzanne's last point, which is basically the erosion of the utility of the dollar as a reserve currency and the relevance of the Western financial system that we've established, and put it not just in the Iran context, but in the Russian context as well. Is that a problem? Is it going forward, or are you not worried about it?
No, I agree 100% with that point. I think anecdotally, what I've seen from traveling in Asia, certainly in China specifically, I think, is that the vacuum that could be created by the latest wave of unilateral sanctions, and if the primary stick that the U.S. has is, to take the U.S. financial system away from those who would run afoul of the sanctions, and if there is an alternative, a viable alternative that develops over time, again, Russia, China seem to be the most logical places where we could see that. I think that is going to ultimately erode, sort of U.S. supremacy in the financial markets.
So I have probably an idiosyncratic view on this, and it's something I've actually done a little bit of writing and thinking on. So I make a couple of points on this issue. I mean, first, bottom line, yes, I do worry about the U.S. kind of driving foreign countries to set up alternative payment and investment mechanisms. They are running against some fairly significant headwinds in doing that. I mean, the FT actually, and this is data that's been out there, but it was just reported last week as well, and the FT pointed out that if you look post-financial crisis, the role of the U.S. financial system globally vis-a-vis Europe, European financial system, actually seen significant expansion of the relative role of U.S. banks relative to their European competitors for a variety of kind of issues completely unrelated to sanctions. So I think there are some sort of headwinds against Europe and other countries setting up alternatives, some sort of market headwinds. That said, you give European governments, Germany, enough of a political incentive, and China already, Lord knows, has enough of a political incentive, and some time, and I think they will succeed in setting up payment mechanisms in particular, and to a lesser extent, investment pools that are immune from U.S. jurisdiction, and that will ensure that sort of a small European company that wants to continue to trade with Iran will be able to get paid for that trade, or continue with Russia will be able to get paid for that trade. That said, the financial system is only one of the mechanisms we have here. So the U.S. would still have some leverage, particularly vis-a-vis U.S. corporate, large European and other corporates. And that is simply the U.S. market that Suzanne talked about. I mean, Total, notably, has announced that it is pulling out of Iran. That's not because Total can't figure out how to keep moving money into Iran, or how to keep paying Iran for its oil. It's because Total worries that we will sanction Total. And we would still have that leverage, even if the Europeans succeed in getting a financial channel up and running.
You want to add anything, or can I go on? One of the things that we've all sort of danced around here that maybe you can further comment on is how do you determine whether these things are effective or not? At one point, I think Suzanne suggested that at least for the administration, maybe effectiveness means, are we getting away with it? Are the targeted parties, not Iran, Russia, but are the companies that we are attempting, whose behavior we are attempting to alter, are they altering their behavior? Another issue, which you also alluded to, is are we altering the target country's behavior, which is a different question. Anybody want to comment on what is the more important objective here? And if the more important objective is altering the target country's behavior, are we succeeding in any of these cases? Iran, Russia, Sudan, take your pick. Cuba. Peter?
Very briefly, and then I'll pass it to Suzanne. I mean, on Iran, I agree with Suzanne. I think the administration has laid out this kind of wish list that boils down to Iran should become Norway or Switzerland, and then we're okay. With Iran, I don't think that's going to happen any more than Suzanne does, and so I think that we're unlikely to see any diplomatic, success, if you will. I think the administration is, of course, viewing impacts more in the sort of short term. Are we having economic, macroeconomic, fiscal, those kinds of impacts? And there, I think we are. And when I look at Russia, I think the administration is probably a similar bucket. I don't think we are changing Putin's strategic calculus really at all. That said, we are potentially having some economic impacts. And if you subscribe to a theory, which I think many policymakers do, that we are in a long-term, 5-10-year confrontation with Russia, kind of slowing them down economically might be, the outcome that people in fact are looking for.
Well, yeah, and I spoke to this, but I think, we are definitely having a severe economic impact on Iran, and that has political fallout for the Iranians. What we haven't yet seen is a real change in behavior on any of the 12 desiderata that Secretary Pompeo laid out in terms of how Iran conducts itself in the region. I will be a little bit humble about this. I think many people watched as first the Bush and then the Obama administrations ramped up pressure on Iran and said, oh, the Iranians don't negotiate under pressure. They've experienced far worse economic conditions before. And meanwhile, there were back channels that were already beginning to develop about finding an exit ramp. And I think that's what's missing from the policy, is that there isn't a sort of sense of possibility on the part of the other side that there is a way to get out from under these sanctions. I think, given the Iranians' experience of 40 years of sanctions, given the fact that they made a deal specifically in order to get sanctions lifted, only to see the sanctions reimposed less than 2 years later. I think from their perspective, they need a greater degree of confidence that another negotiation would actually lead to a durable desanctioning process. And in the use of this tool, that's one of the big issues. Had the politics gone differently here, I think we would have been in a situation where the Iran nuclear deal would have been under great pressure and strain, but it would have been from the Iranian side, because they really had oversold it to their own population as a kind of wholesale rehabilitation and return to the international financial community, which it never was intended to be. And part of that gets into this question of are there ways to use sanctions for negotiation in which it's not all or nothing. We have really, I think, with the Iran case, made it a zero-sum game. Either you take everything off, because otherwise, even partial desanctioning isn't worth it, or you put everything back on.
Before we go to Ken, I just can't resist Peter's comment. You want to add something?
Yeah.
Peter's comment reminded me of an old story that might be appropriate. When the Shah's regime was crumbling, people were rioting, one of his advisors suggested that things would go better for him if he ruled more like the King of Norway. And the Shah's response was, if my subject were Norwegian, that would be a lot easier.
Thank you, Bill. And, I think you were probably starting to work on some of those sanctions issues back.
Not quite that.
Not quite that far back, sorry. We're going to take questions from the room. We'll try to do it like we did the last time, take 2 or 3. Please identify yourself. And because we're running out of time, if you can keep your questions very short, start there.
That's a familiar face back there.
I'm not sure that's a compliment. This is Bill Lane, Trade for America. My question is, historically, the focus here is on unilateral sanctions. And historically, one of the biggest costs of unilateral sanctions were that American firms became painted as unreliable suppliers. And the 2 best examples was the grain embargo, whereas if you go to the Midwest today, they will say we still haven't recovered from the Carter grain embargo, and the Soviet pipeline restrictions, which ceded that market to the Japanese. Are you starting to see examples, either anecdotal or statistical, where American capital goods producers are starting to be painted as unreliable suppliers?
Let's take one over. We have one in the middle over here.
Hi, Jeff Stern, recent master's grad. My question is about security services like the Revolutionary Guard or, people from the Russian FSB with stakes in business in their country. Do sanctions tend to benefit these groups, or would it be better for them with no sanctions where they can get a bigger piece of a larger pie?
We take those 2 and then we'll go over here and take this.
Okay, the first one was on the U.S. reliable supplier. Who wants to comment?
offer quick thoughts on both of those issues and then pass the mic here since I know we're running out of time. I have not really seen that as of yet. I mean, I think to the extent that the new increased sanctions are perhaps tarnishing certain U.S. relationships, and in terms of just complicating again, whether it's payments, whether it's supply relationships, whatever the case may be, I do think that that's, again, I think there's probably a little bit of a lag, and we haven't quite seen that yet, or I have not quite seen that yet, but I would not be surprised if we could be heading in that direction in the next year or two if the sort of pace keeps up. On the security services question, I would just say, again, as given my enforcement background, I think we certainly felt in the enforcement community that, there was something about at least making it more difficult for the IRGC, FSB, et cetera, to sort of get their piece of the pie. I think everybody understands that they're probably still going to be profiting, benefiting to some extent, even with the sanctions. And I take your point that perhaps they are best well positioned to evade and to still reap those profits. But I do think that at least on the enforcement side of the equation, there was the feeling that again, making things a little more difficult for them was probably to the net benefit of the U.S.
So I'm going to limit my remarks just to Bill's question in the interest of time. And like Brian, I haven't, talking to companies, seen a lot of that kind of unreliability of supply, or at least relative concern about U.S. suppliers being unreliable. I think some of that is just, this sort of sense of how much of this is there going to be over the next couple of years. Is this just a phase? I also think, in a way, the secondary sanctions and the Trump administration's aggressive use of secondary sanctions blunt that, because it makes European companies unreliable suppliers too, as they comply. So I think that's actually blunted it. The one area, though, where I have seen it was the ZTE case. I think that the ZTE case, which I won't get into detail, but I think the Trump administration very badly mishandled. I think that sent a very strong message to tech companies in China, in particular, that the U.S. is not going to be a reliable supplier here, and that this has real consequences. We might have already been headed down that road anyway, just given the overall relationship, but I think that is the one area where I do see some evidence of what you put on the table.
Let's just take these two over here and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
Sure, Byron Cowan, Capital Alpha Partners. You talked a bit about Russian sanctions, not much happening this year, but what happens next year? How is this shaped by the midterm elections? What could be triggering events?
So real quickly on Russia, so I think the midterms are going to be a very determining factor in future Russia sanctions. I mean, the current dynamic you basically see on Capitol Hill is Senate driving Russia sanctions policy, House not under Republican control, not being all that keen to act. Senate, oversimplified, basically wanting to be a responsible stakeholder here. I mean, they want to put pressure on Russia, but as we've seen with their hearings, they want to think about collateral costs and that kind of thing. I think that if Republicans retain control of both chambers, you'll see a similar dynamic next year, but with sufficient time and momentum to pass something. I think if Democrats take the House, you'll see the dynamic flip. I think you'll see a high degree of interest by House Democrats to pass a quite aggressive sanctions bill quite early next year that the Senate would then be in the position of reacting to. So I think you'd see a very different dynamic there.
Okay. Ken, is this the end?
This is the end. Thank you all for sticking around. Thank you to this panel. Super informative, really, really helpful, very grateful. We will look forward to welcoming all of you back at our future events, and hope you take some time to look at our new website that we just launched this month at www.wita.org. Thank you.